And we're live.
Hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Weinfield, and I'm the artistic director of Sonnambula, which is a chamber ensemble engaged in historically informed practice of music of the early modern period, or 16th through 18th centuries. This is In Music's Time, which is a lecture series that we've launched during the COVID-19 pandemic that seeks to illuminate moments in music history via interdisciplinary exchange. So far, I've spoken with a paintings curator, an opera director, but today I'm speaking with someone who is possibly the closest so far in discipline to that of the musicologist, and that is the ethnomusicologist and my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Fredara Hadley. Fredara Hadley, PhD, is ethnomusicology professor at the Juilliard School. She specializes in researching, writing, and teaching African American music. Committed to sharing knowledge about Black music by any means possible, including appearing on her colleagues' lecture series, Dr. Hadley has been published in academic journals and outlets including Billboard Magazine and PBS, where she's written on a variety of topics, including Black women vocal groups such as Sweet Honey in the Rock, and the effect of gentrification on the music of Black communities. She's presented her research at universities and at conferences, both domestically and abroad. And her commentary is featured in several documentaries, including, and pay attention to this, the recently released PBS documentary, The Black Church, hosted by Professor Henry Louis Gates. Her ongoing projects, some of which we'll talk about today, focus on the musical impact of historically Black colleges and universities, and on Shirley Graham Du Bois, who's one of the earliest Black women musicologists and opera composers. Dr. Hadley recently graduated with her PhD from Indiana University. So Fredara, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
It's lovely to see you. So let's start from scratch. Let's start at the very beginning. You are an ethnomusicologist, not a musicologist, an ethnomusicologist. Can you explain what that is to our audience? And also, can you tell us how you embody that description?
That's a great question. And I think what might have been the answer 10, 20 years ago is very different now, thankfully, as ethnomusicology and musicology plays even more closely together. But I'm an ethnomusicologist, and so what often distinguishes that field from musicology is that we are really bent on ethnography and the lived experience and doing field work in addition to transcription and musical analysis. And we're really interested in the contemporary moment. And so even if we're looking at a historical tradition, then how does it come alive in performance in the moment? And so we all ethnomusicologists do the rites of passage of field work someplace, somewhere, perhaps largely virtually now because of COVID, but bringing in that sort of really deep cultural knowledge to our musical examination through participant observation, and direct engagement with musicians and all the stakeholders, audiences, everyone involved in the music making process. And so how I embody that's a great question. I think in my teaching, I embody it in teaching both world music sort of oriented courses and teaching about the field and what ethnomusicology is interested in. I just came out of a class with undergraduates where I was talking about how the briar patch that is musical classification, how we organize music by genre and the hierarchies that often get embedded in that, and how ethnomusicology pushes against and sometimes rarefies and confirms those hierarchies as well. But also in just thinking about how I teach African American music, for instance. I spend a lot of time in that course making sure and teaching my students how to understand the aesthetic models that are at play when they're listening to and engaging African American music. So how to listen to it, right? There are overlaps very often between what they're learning in Western art music and how they engage popular music, but there are some things that are culturally specific. And so I don't take for granted that we know what those things are. And I think it is essential to move through those aesthetics so that they can understand what is the meaning that is being derived from these performances. If we're talking about something in the Black church, or we're talking about something on the HBCU campus, what is this performance doing for this group of people? Those are the kinds of questions I hope my students are able to ask after our time together.
Do you feel that it's natural to put forward the performer's perspective when you are practicing ethnography? Does that come naturally to your work?
It does come naturally. I think it's the default to see the person who is doing the thing as the locus of the knowledge. Like you are doing the work, you're making this happen. And so I need to understand from you how that happens. But what I've also learned is that audiences are incredibly discriminate and discerning and articulate in what their expectations are, what made a performance exceptional or lackluster, what makes this style of performance different from the other. And so in my research, I've learned to take a bit of a broader view of that. The performer's perspective is still obviously incredibly important and valid, but there are all of these other points of entry that are intriguing and informative as well.
That's so interesting. And there are a lot of dualities there, I think, with regards to how the historical performance movement approaches performing as well, which I want to get into maybe a little bit later. But I want you to tell us about Shirley Graham Du Bois. But first of all, tell us how you refer to her. I think there's a lack of consistency, at least there is in musicology, about naming women performers, naming women composers, first name, last name. So can you address that? And then tell us how you came to study her.
So thank you for that question. And I'm glad you asked it because it was a source. It's something that my colleague, who I did a lot of this work with, Professor Tamika Nunley, and I thought a lot about, and we were explicit in terms of our reasoning for that, for addressing her in a couple different ways. So on one level, if I'm speaking about her kind of informally, I'll refer to her as Aunt Shirley because she feels very familiar to me, and we happen to be a part of the same sorority, and like it just feels like this work just kind of called out to us at a particular point in time. It feels familial even. Yeah. And so I'll say Aunt Shirley is at it again, and I got to get back to this piece of it or whatever the case may be. But when I am referring to her in settings such as this, I refer to her as Graham Du Bois.
Graham Du Bois.
Yes, okay. Graham Du Bois, because she, as people who know of her often know of her as W.B. Du Bois's second wife. And she was very proud and very happy to be married to Dr. Du Bois. But the period in which she was most musically active, she was Shirley Graham. And so I like keeping that. So if you look at Tom Tom, or you look at her master's thesis, The Survival of Africanisms in Modern Music, all of those are published under Shirley Graham, and sometimes the last name of her first husband, McCants, but very often she's Shirley Graham. Her most productive periods in terms of her writing and her creative output as a playwright, all of these eras, she's Shirley Graham. And so I like acknowledging that period of her life while also acknowledging the marriage that she freely entered into with a husband that she loved, and referring to her as Graham Du Bois. Yeah.
I see. That's marvelous. So tell us about her. Tell us about Tom Tom. Tell us about her life and work.
Yeah. So this is the area of work that I felt brought me like closer to what musicologists do, because it was in the beginning all historical in nature and really grappling with, okay, Tom Tom is an opera that premiered in 1932 to 25,000 people as a part of the Cleveland Summer Opera Festival. And so I found this fact out, and it seemed as though she was the first Black woman to compose and stage her own opera. And I'm like, this is incredible, right? And what that meant was, and it has not been performed since in its entirety. Excerpts of it have been performed, but it was never performed again after 1932.
Really? So calling performers who are looking for something to do.
Exactly, right? And so how this all happened was, before I was at Juilliard, I was a professor at Oberlin, and I was trying to pull together institutional knowledge about African-American composers and who had attended the conservatory. So people like William Grant Still, Nathaniel Dett. I had heard Shirley Graham Du Bois' name, but I didn't really know about her. And so I decided to roll up my sleeves and go to the archive and actually pull the files of these different composers and musicians to see what I could find. And that's when I discovered a lot about Shirley Graham Du Bois. And it just so happened that my colleague Tamika Nunley was in the archive. She's a historian at the same time, and we're great friends. And I asked her, well, what are you doing here? She's like, oh, I'm looking up stuff on Shirley Graham Du Bois. I'm like, so am I. And it just literally blossomed from there. We were like, we ought to teach companion courses about her. We want to bring this opera back to people's hearing, literally breathe new life into it. And so what I discovered is that and this gets into canons and like who remains a part of the canon, who is left out of canons, whose work is repeatedly performed, whose work isn't, all those questions. It takes an inordinate amount of energy to reclaim these works. That's number one. It also takes a lot of institutional fortitude and support to do that as well. And I think for lots of different reasons, partly the political climate that we're in, the Black Lives Matter movement, it helped the story of Shirley Graham Du Bois and her opera to gain traction, not just at Oberlin, but different places as well, Harvard most especially, where Lucy Kaplan has been working with the opera directly to try and get excerpts of it performed. I say all that to say, her opera itself, and she wrote her own program notes. And it's an opera that's 3 acts that goes from kind of unspecified pre-colonial, Africa at the point of capture, the antebellum South in Act 2, and Harlem in the 1930s in Act 3. So a very contemporary Harlem. She's writing in the 1930s, right? And it opens with timpani, the opera does, to kind of set the stage in this percussive home. I think she had 8 or 12 timpani in this opera. But it's the journey of Africans to becoming African Americans in the rural South to the North. And she says about it in the program notes, I can't, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she says, I can't, people ask me about how I came to write Tom Tom, and I can't speak of composing Tom Tom, for it's a story that's been with me for a really long time, even before I came to this earth. This is the story that has been of my existence. And so opera then becomes the medium through which she can divulge and share this really intimate journey, her intimate take on this journey that redistributed millions of people of African descent around the New World. And so, and we think it's one of the first serious takes on Africa, really trying to imagine Africa as a place. And it's important to say she had studied at the Sorbonne before she came to Oberlin with Nadia Boulanger. She had encountered Francophone Africans, all of that. And so she was thinking in really concrete terms, musicologically, about what she was doing. And it was just a remarkable story to me. So I'll share my screen so that you can see the front page of the program notes here. And it's 5 main characters that recur throughout all 3 acts. But Jules Bledsoe, she had top tier talent performing these pieces. And you see here, she's credited in opera in 3 acts by Miss Shirley Graham Du Bois. She modeled what we would kind of mark as community engagement by recruiting singers to fill out the chorus from churches and choral ensembles throughout the Cleveland area. And this was broadcast live on NBC radio, and the governor of Ohio was there. So for all of this auspicious premiere, we haven't ever gotten to hear it again. And so, my work has been in reminding us of her as a composer, as a musicologist, and lots of different people are working towards trying to get this stage. Most notably, let me say, Caroline Jackson Smith and Courtney Savali Andrews at Oberlin, who are teaching a course on Tom Tom this semester.
Oh, that's really something. And I mean, it must take an enormous amount of institutional support to put together a lost opera. It's just not just sort of a small set of chamber works. This is a you were talking about the canon and about hierarchy. And so I'm curious about the engagement within the project of Graham Du Bois. I'm curious about the engagement of ethnomusicology with alterity, in which the other, to quote Lotte Nushin, becomes not an orbital unit, but it becomes an important source of power in the history. And this is it's a relationship between the other and the mainstream, or let's say between a minority and a majority, is something that Stephen Amico remarks in that recent issue of the Journal of Musicology, which was devoted to the complicated relationship that ethnomusicology and musicology apparently have. He calls that relationship between the minority and the majority a sort of never stable relationship. And in order to bring out a sort of dynamic change or a restabilization forefronting the other, as it were, the history has to be approached intersectionally, or it has to be approached in an interdisciplinary way. And I have to admit that this is where I feel myself sometimes in a bit of an identity crisis as a musicologist who engages sometimes in ethnographic processes. As you know, I study work by Jewish women, crypto-Jews. So in fact, people with a kind of travestied identity, let's say. So I feel on the one hand like an ethnographer because I'm excavating work that has been heretofore unstudied, and by a composer that's in a minority group that intersects with and against a dominant party. But yet in my studies on the work of the 17th century composer Leonora Duarte, for example, I feel like I'm faced with work that has no specifically ethnic Jewish sound per se. It's concerted music. It's rife with diverse influence and scope for influence, and in fact it negates a contemporaneous stereotype or topos of Jewish sound, sort of born of the synagogue. So I realized right away upon working on Duarte how faulty the project of looking for Jewish sound was, because her work actually reveals just how diverse the history of Jewish music is. And so I want to ask you, how do you address issues of ethnic identity, issues of identity, gender, with regards to Graham Du Bois's music? And how does ethnography aid in that quest or guide your work? And have you ever encountered problems such as those that I've just articulated?
Those are all great questions, and I spend a lot of time thinking about all of them.
Sure, that you do.
Yeah, and so the question that you bring up in your own work about what can be the fool's errand of going to listen for Jewish sound or Jewishness in music, is something that I explicitly warn against in my African American music classes, right? And I handle that in two ways. One, I tell them I'm not gonna give you a quantitative checklist that you can take a piece of music and say, okay, does it have dense polyrhythms, call and response, flat fifth, are those things happening? Like, no, we're not going to do that. But we are going to understand the ways of music making. And then however that manifests in the music, we're going to let that be what it is, right? And I'm thinking of the musicologist, pioneering African-American musicologist, Eileen Southern. And she in her work too, pushes against that sort of trait list approach to Black music or Black sound. And I often tell my students, Black music is whatever music Black people make, right? Like however that comes out into the world, that's what it is, right? Because that's how we get, when we don't think that way, that's how we get the marginalization of Black classical music, techno, Black participation in country music, old time music, all of those things. So that's one of the things that I think about very, very often. And so with Shirley, what became really important to me, and again, this is where I was like, I gotta lean on my musicology colleagues a little bit, because I needed to world build a little bit. I needed to understand, because African Americans aren't central in the Western art music canon, I needed to understand what was happening with Black classical musicians and composers in the 1930s, because that's also where you had the premiere of Florence Price's symphony, William Grant Stills, and William Dawson, all in that same period.
Wow.
So and in her master's thesis, Shirley Graham Du Bois was an ethnographer as well. She analyzed all three of those symphonies and interviewed each composer about their works in 1934. So this is in the midst of their riding high on these premieres. And she did her own musical analysis, as well as asking them, what did you intend in the Negro Folk Symphony, William Dawson, right? And so in the work that we've done to start, and I like your word, excavate and bring back time. I have, and my colleagues as well, we have really tried to immerse ourselves in that world of the 1930s that made a tom possible. But also because she was so interested in Africa, and that's a through line in her life, going to Ghana as well, where she became a citizen and worked in the Ghanaian government, to understand and talk to people about sort of what the role of music and arts, sort of classical music in particular, in that culture as well, to try and understand where she would ultimately go politically as a way to back into more the meaning that she imbued in Tom the opera. If these are themes that remained with her, as she says, before she was even here, and that remain with her after Tom premieres, trying to kind of back into that a little bit. And people said that she carried this opera with her, carried the manuscript around, the score with her around the world after it premiered, hoping that in some way, shape, or form it would come back. She'd be able to restage it. So I think those are the main, and looking at too, it's the world building that is probably the bedrock of my ethnographic approach, to say that who are her collaborators? Who are the kinds of people she returns to over and over again? Because after studying her for a while, I feel like Tom is the first major statement that she makes of her politics, and politics that don't really shift that much over the course of the rest of her life. So having the benefit of being retrospective about it, that world building helps us to kind of tease out all of the layers of meaning and intention in her work.
That's fascinating. What was her reception like in Ghana? Do you know much about that?
Yes. So she moved with Du Bois to Ghana in 1961, I think 60 or 61. And Ghana is the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from European colonizers. And they become independent in 1957. And the founding president, the first president of Ghana, first prime minister turned president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, had studied in the United States and went to Lincoln University, which is the HBCU in Pennsylvania, and also went to University of Pennsylvania for his master's, and was heavily influenced by W.B. Du Bois. And so at this point, Du Bois has been dogged by lawsuits and the American government, quite honestly, and had his passport revoked. And Shirley Graham Du Bois was an unapologetic communist. So when we're thinking about why she was pushed out of, she was known and popular in her lifetime. And so when we think about why she was no longer it isn't just race and gender, it is race and gender, but it's also political affiliations, right? And so Kwame Nkrumah offers them harbor and says, listen, America seems like it's not treating you that well. It's not going great for you there. You should move to Ghana, where I will make you citizens and give you these esteemed positions. And they take him up on those offers, and they're really committed to the notion of Pan-Africanism, which is one of the strongest themes in the opera itself. So we see this full circle moment where she goes from writing about it as a composer to embodying it in her citizenry and in her vocation as a government official in Ghana.
Fredara, we have a question that's just come in from email. Was Shirley Graham Du Bois involved with working with any visual artists, perhaps collaborating on visual musical projects to promote her work?
That's a great question. Without being able to cite a specific instance, I feel like surely she must have been. She was also a playwright and staged performances as a part of the Federal Theater Project in Chicago. And I feel like that, obviously theater has a visual component, and I feel like that would lend itself to those kinds of collaborations. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I wouldn't be surprised if we unearthed one. Not at all.
Curious about also the design of that program. I mean, it seems very sort of situated in sort of typeface and design of the 1930s.
It is striking. Oh yeah, that's right, because you're also an art historian, so you would pick up on that.
I pretend to also be an art historian. We have a comment from Courtney Savali Andrews, who says, and oh, what fun we're having interpreting the score amongst other traditions of Black drama and music in this era. Progress is being made.
Yes, I want to just shout out Courtney Savali Andrews, who I mentioned earlier. She and Caroline Jackson Smith are doing an incredible job of just working through the monumental task. All that was left was that handwritten score. And so that's, you're talking about ground zero kind of excavative work. But Courtney is a brilliant ethnomusicologist and musician, and Caroline Jackson Smith is a brilliant director, dramatist, and all those things. So I am really thrilled to just support and see how they bring this back to us.
Talking with you, Fredara, makes me think about, again, where my own work lies, sort of in the musicological conversation about ethnicity and about identity. And I think about these sort of preconditions that exist for what Jewish composer means in history. And I think we've kind of addressed a little bit of this already, but in early modern Europe, at least, this has been defined, Jewish composer has been defined largely by Salomone Rossi, for example, this sort of one example of Baroque Jewish composer, you know, that we read about in music history. And so for Rossi, Jewish composer means, well, it means male, it means someone who could live openly as a Jew, it means someone who could write for the synagogue, someone who could have music published, and so on. But Leonora Duarte, for example, couldn't do any of those things. She was a woman. Her family had converted to Catholicism. Judaism was illegal in 17th century Antwerp for most of the century. And because of that, she is writing for the domestic space. This is a space that tends to be explained away sometimes in musicology, particularly in Western music history, as an amateur space. But if we center Duarte here, her talents kind of change that conversation. And the terms amateur, the terms professional become quite vague, and they become actually quite interrelational. So I'm wondering about this in your work as well. Can you talk to us about this bifurcation of amateur and professional in your work on Graham Du Bois, but also on African-American women composers more generally? How does the domestic space or the salon or other places where music making by women is happening kind of complicate that terminology?
I love this question. I really do, because it was my work on Graham Du Bois that made me really understand that none of those terms are objective, or that they are loaded, right? They have all of these connotations and implications that we may not intend, and often we really do intend. In general, I think that we are dismissive of music that is meaningful to women and to girls, whether you're talking about in popular music or whatever the kind of axis of that is. And when I was teaching a course on Graham Du Bois, I used the work of Brittany Cooper, the scholar Brittany Cooper, where she talks about the legacy, the intellectual legacy of race women, Black women from the early 20th century, who were all about uplifting the race, racial uplift as a concept, and all of this kind of notion. And she said, because avenues to academia, where one could publish in those kind of conventional opportunities were not available to the majority of Black women, then we need to look at an eclectic archive of what Black women thought about their lives. And so she posits an eclectic archive looking at the clubs that Black women created, looking at sort of how they framed their domestic lives, the salons that they created. And so by going down that path, it opened up a pantheon of ways to understand both Black women's intellectual history. Farah Jasmine Griffin writes a lot about, edited a volume on toward a Black a history, intellectual history of Black women. But also, well, there are 2 points I want to make. One is, and looking at Graham Du Bois, particularly after Tom Tom, yes, it's true, Tom Tom was never performed again. But if you look at Black newspapers, she is consistently performing recitals hosted by the sorority of which she is a member, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. They are one of her largest benefactors and supporters. And this is the second oldest Black sorority in the country, founded in 1913, with chapters all over the country of college educated Black women who have the means and the ability to bring her to Detroit, bring her to Chicago, bring her to Pittsburgh, right? And so there is this whole classical world, that Black classical world that she's engaging in, that would likely not make it into our conversation about her musical activity, because if we follow the traditional routes, we wouldn't know to look at Black newspapers, and we wouldn't necessarily know what Delta Sigma Theta was, right? And so like those nodes and networks are fascinating to me. And you mentioned salons, and there are 2 ways that was really important to her. The historian Treva Lindsay wrote a book called Colored No More, all about Black women's club movements and whatnot in Washington, D.C., late 20th century, early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. And in her work, and I'm from Florida and I love Zora Neale Hurston, and I wondered, had they ever interacted at all? And there's no real kind of like silver bullet on that, but they were participants in the same Black women's salon circles in Washington, D.C. at the same time. Yeah. And so these were spaces in which Black women could develop and try out their artistic and creative ideas. And then when she was studying at the Sorbonne in the 1920s, we know about Parisian salon culture. And that's where she really started to make friends with Francophone Africans and sort of participating in salon culture there, that starts to incubate some of the musical ideas that she then brings to her own work, right? And so these informal networks, both where Black women serve as performers and, you know, they can just be free to exchange ideas, are absolutely essential to their creative output. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's really important in this moment where everybody's talking about underrepresented composers, and that's really important. But even as we incorporate more African-American composers into the canon, to always acknowledge the communities, the Black communities that have sustained them, while many of our institutions have ignored them. Like, bring those communities into and those networks into the conversation as well.
I want you to talk a little bit more about that, about the idea of sustaining the work that is being done by yourself, by your colleagues, and thinking back to the salon, and just to stay in that conversation for a moment. At least in early modern Europe, this salon was often kind of an interdisciplinary space. It was often an art viewing space, the Kunstkammer, right, the collector's cabinet.
Mhm.
So when we add music making to that salon, the salon that I am familiar with, the sort of proto salon, I guess, the 17th century proto salon, the Kunstkammer, or the salon as an ideology, of course, gains a sonic layer. It gains a sort of sonic dimension, and music making becomes sort of a vehicle for contemplation, a vehicle for community, a vehicle for observation, for all of these kinds of transactions that art and juxtaposition in art also really encourage. And these kinds of interactions are imprinted, I think, into the music that I work on, music that comes out of this space, or at least I read it in that way. Many of Duarte's works, for example, feature sort of these contrasting motivic and thematic layers that resonate with some of the physical traits of the spaces in which they were first written and in which they were first performed and listened to and looked at. And this perpetuates a kind of economics of looking and hearing. And I say economics here because these spaces were also primarily business spaces of buying and of selling goods. So performance then is juxtaposed with conversation and consumption by guests who would come to the salon, come to the home to see art, to make a business deal, but also to hear and to watch women performing. So these spaces are not only sort of containers of social processes, of economic processes, but they also might be the sort of space that sociologists, I feel, always argue actually sort of generate these practices as well. Henry Lefebvre, for example, identifies the urban salon as a vessel that's particularly conducive to these convergences. So the innate principles of juxtaposition that are expressed in art, expressed in music, play out in the domestic space, but they converge on women's performing bodies. So does the ideology of the salon have this kind of prerequisite with regards to any of the women that you work on? Does that, do those prerequisites, if indeed they are there, do they inform your approach to the music itself, to the score, capital S?
Yes, I would say, in the sense, even if it's not what we recognize as a salon with a capital S, perhaps, if I use that as a stand-in for spaces where women can gather, right? And primarily Black women can gather to have these kinds of exchanges. I would say yes, because in a lot of ways, that idea remains radical for a very long time, right? The notion that Black women can come together and be together and have this interdisciplinary, creative, artistic exchange. And there's a reason why it often happened either in women's houses, homes, or in church spaces. I think you could even argue for representing a good bit of that. And then again, sort of in these sorority affiliated spaces as well, I think they are generative in the sense that it was a space, these were spaces where women were safe, right? And they were free to express all of these artistic ideas, political ideas, and sort of score and imagine what freedom would look like for them. Because I think we have to always remember that what Black people in general, Black women certainly, are trying to point to is freedom and equality. That is always the agenda, right? Both in the collective and sort of racialized sense, but also on the individual sense as well. People are trying to advocate for those things. And so I'm going to take a bit of a tangent, but I think it's still relevant. When we were imagining how to bring Shirley Graham Du Bois back to our hearing as a part of our parlance and back to campus, all those kinds of things, that's part of the reason we decided to host a Shirley Graham Du Bois salon. We were like, that makes sense to us. Before, you talk about performances and all of this, what is this kind of space where we can all come together with her as our theme and be expressive about what we hope to come from this, or how we're imagining freedom through the work that she created? How do we do that? And so I'll share the flyer really quickly, just so you can see it. But it just says Shirley Graham Du Bois, The Road to Recovering Tom Tom, a gathering of creative minds, an intellectual salon. And this was November 12th, back when the world was open in 2019. This was What is Time? And so to me, that was an acknowledgement of how, again, I go back to Brittany Cooper, how these networks of spaces that were ephemeral and always sort of shifting, absolutely essential to the creative output that Black women were able to do. So what thinking like that has then shifted my analysis and how I think about the music itself, because I tend to center Black women not only as a performer, but as the intended audience as well, in order to really understand what is the resonance of a piece of music and what is it doing for this audience, and how then is this music claimed as exceptional or genius among these Black women audiences, right? And so it's made me center not just the performer, but also the shift how I center the performer, but also the audience.
That's so interesting. That actually reminds me very directly of a connection to historical performance, actually, which I might want to tease out now. So historically informed performance, which is sort of one of the subfields, as you know, into which my music falls. I think in HP, we're in a place, I think, where we understand approach to be informed by history, but it's centered completely on the performer. So it's not governed solely by history or by historical accuracy. And we've reached this collective understanding, I think, in historical performance, that authenticity or historical authenticity is a construct, because we can't ever know, for example, how Handel originally sounded. Although actually that's probably a bad example, because there are some organ reels that survive. But in any case, the recreation of some mythic original shouldn't be our goal. And Richard Truscott, of course, has kind of shifted our thinking that way. We're sort of inevitable products of our own time, and we should embrace that. And yet there are still these performance audience relationships in my field that presuppose the ideology of the original historical moment as a kind of a comprehensive governing force for performance. And this is where it becomes, I think, ever more pressing a task for historical performers, and I think maybe for classical musicians more generally, to expose holes in that historiography. So can you talk a little bit more about how your work intersects with what are inevitably ever-changing audience performer relationships, or guidelines maybe that exist between artist and audience? Do you have in your field, do you have your own sort of set of falsely authentic markers that affect audience opinion, or critical opinion of your work?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things that ethnomusicology helps us to think about in its emphasis on the contemporary is what you kind of pointed to already. You can't ever escape the present. It's all we ever have, right?
Right.
And so in the emphasis on the contemporary, the expectation is that it's going to there is no recreation, right? There is no perfect fidelity to what was, right? It's all transitory and sort of phantasmagorical in that regard. It happened and it's just in the ether, right? Like that kind of thing. And so I think that isn't the question so much, but I do often say authenticity in general is a fool's errand. Like that's just not a super productive thing to chase after. But our discourse about it does reveal what we think is important about the performance and the music, whatever we think is essential about that, right? And so I find that line of inquiry to be really important to follow. And so even if you're talking about a piece or a work like Tom Tom, it shouldn't be staged exactly the way it was in 1932 and 2021, right? And I have full faith in the creative team working on it. But there are choices that I think they are processing and figuring out because of where we were in 1932, what was radical and really progressive in 1932 in terms of ideas or the implementation of ideas may read very, very differently in 2021. And so it makes sense that you acknowledge that and you look at that and make whatever decision you think is appropriate about that. But I am one who doesn't see that as being a knock on quote unquote authenticity. I think what is more important, and this is where I go back to the world building that we did around her, is understanding her intention behind the work, what she hoped this opera would do or show or achieve. And the more you understand that, the better I think guidance you have on how to navigate what Tom Tom looks like in 2021, right? And so, and again, I would say that's probably the ethnographer in me speaking, saying like, how much can we learn about her? Like, how much can we learn about the composer she was in dialogue with? How much can we learn about, you know, what she was reading? Because it is this profound political statement she's making to the world, right? And by opening her opera with timpani, she's coming out of the gate saying, this is different, right? This is a different, even if the apparatus is still the same, I'm filling it with some different things and some different ideas, right? And so I don't know if that answered your question at all, but that's generally how I try to approach it.
Yeah, it's fascinating hearing you talk about fidelity. We talk about fidelity to the score in historical performance so often, and there's so many points of cohesion there.
Can I add something really quickly too?
Yes.
I think this is also where it matters that we're dealing with opera, yes, but also African-American composer in the sense that one of the aesthetics in African-American music is, and Melanie Burnham, ethnomusicologist Melanie Burnham talks about this beautifully. The expectation is that no two performances are going to be the same, and that there will be some type, even if you're talking about a hymn like Amazing Grace that is ubiquitous, right? When you sing it or when I sing it, my interpretation of it will be my own, even if everybody already knows the words, the melody, all of that. And so I think that creates a space where within the cultural values of the composer, you have room to be interpretive that comes from the aesthetics of the composer directly. So I just wanted to add that.
And also the performer's life history and where they are in that moment. And
absolutely. And I'm thinking about an opera that recently premiered with Opera Philadelphia by Courtney Bryan, who's a brilliant composer, also an Oberlin grad and African American, but how she built improvisation into her latest opera, Blessed, right? And so no performances are ever the same, but she built by creating passages for improvisation in it, she guarantees that they will be different every time it's performed. So yeah.
And so that plays into this historiography of the fact that no two performances are the same. That's
right.
I love it. We have a question, Fredara, from email. This says that there seem to be some interesting parallels here. This is a few minutes ago, so a few conversational steps behind where we are now. There seem to be some parallels here with the life of Nina Simone, particularly her politics and external forces wanting to silence her, her trips to Africa, etc. Do you happen to know if Nina Simone, who is obviously living years later, where did it go? Oh, is familiar with the work of Shirley Graham Du Bois?
That's a great question. And I think that if I'm not mistaken, once Shirley Graham Du Bois immigrated to Ghana, at some point in the 1970s, she wants to come back to the United States. And, you know, she was tailed by the FBI. There's an FBI file on her and all this that happened. And there she was, and I go back to the point, she was known in her lifetime, right? And so sometimes we get into these narratives like, oh, this person was an unsung hero. It's not necessarily the case with her. She wrote a whole string of biographies on everyone from like George Washington Carver to Paul Robeson, and made a good amount of money doing that. And so she was known in her lifetime. And I think that Nina Simone was one of the people who helped advocate for her ability to come back into the country. The people who pushed for her ability to return to the US to kind of take up these lecture posts and hit the lecture circuit, where it was a list of venerable Black celebrities of the time. And I believe that Nina Simone was among those people. But it's important in thinking about Ghana in the 1950s and 60s, Accra was like the center of all of that kind of Pan-Africanist thought. So Accra, Dakar, Senegal, places like that. And so at the time that she's there, Maya Angelou is living in Accra. Malcolm X comes through Accra twice. And so it's one of those places that Black artists go. And this is the dawn of people being able, you know, the jet age, where traveling to the continent of Africa is a thing that is actually attainable for people, right? And she's in the mix of all of that. And she was very close with Paul Robeson. So all of those musicians who were certainly leftists and communists are comrades. And, you know, she had a really strong personality, sometimes frenemies as well. But I believe that Nina Simone was a part of the group of people who advocated for her return to the US. That, I don't have any indication that they were close friends, although she was also good friends with Josephine Baker. And she was close friends with Mary Makeba of South Africa. And she had a relationship with Catherine Dunham as well. And so those were some of the people in her, other Black women, artists and creators in her circles.
Wonderful. So actually quite a direct connection. Another question, I was wondering if, from the YouTube chat bar, I was wondering if Fredara can talk about her engagements with contemporary technology and media. I understand that she was involved with the founding of a television network in Ghana.
Yes. And so she was the first director of television in Ghana. So this is a fledgling nation, just got its independence in 1957. And what Kwame Nkrumah is interested in, and why they're kindred spirits, is he believes in all coming from Marcus Garvey's ideology of Africa for the Africans, and really kind of bolstering national culture, African pride, and all of these things. And so he brought her in, and he's obviously the president of Ghana, but he's trying to think of more or less a United States of Africa as well. He understands, and he was right about this, the only shot they had at pushing against neo-colonial forces was to unite. That didn't happen, but Shirley Graham agrees with him in that. in terms of what they do in Ghana, he wants to promote against, the tyranny of colonialism, amplify local cultures, local languages, of which there are dozens in what is now Ghana. And so she comes in as a director of television programming, brokering a relationship with a Japanese, I think it's Sanyo television manufacturer. And I actually went to Ghana to the National Archives to like pull these papers and read them, to do television manufacturing and TVs and electronics in Ghana. That never happened, but she's thinking about that. Yeah. And in terms of programming, she doesn't want to, what lots of newly independent African nations are doing are just piping in programming from Europe into their new countries. And she wants to come up with local programming that reflects the languages in which the programs are being shown. She's thinking about those things, and she's thinking about, okay, in the village, everyone doesn't have a TV, so we need to set up kind of like these communal living rooms where people can gather together to watch this programming. And it needs to be, and it's ironic, right? Because she herself is not Ghanaian, but this is, and there's complications around that positionality too. But her thrust is to anchor it in what is meaningful and important to Ghanaians rather than what is being imported from elsewhere.
That's interesting. And of course, also the television extends the salon. It extends the idea of the salon ad infinitum, potentially. I should just mention that last question was from our lovely colleague at Juilliard, Edgardo Salinas. Hello, Edgardo.
Hello, Edgardo.
I think, Fredara, we're almost at the hour, but maybe I'll just ask one last final question, unless anyone has any more questions from the chat bar, to tell us about the Black Church, to tell us about this documentary that you participated in.
Yes, it was a joy and a privilege to work on this project. Obviously, you can't tell all of the stories connected to the Black Church in 4 hours, but my hope is that it presented a top line sort of documentary approach to the evolution of the Black Church, that then now we can pull off pieces and do more in-depth study of the Black Church. That project meant a lot to me for a lot of different reasons. I am the daughter of Reverend Mary L. Shannon, my maternal grandmother, who was an ordained Baptist minister. I am the daughter and granddaughter of Baptist deacons. I am the daughter of a church minister of education, my mother. And so I'm a product of Black Baptist traditions. No matter where I go in life, I will still be Baptist. And so that was an opportunity and I was fortunate enough to consult on it and appear in it, but to really try and figure out what all these musical shifts that happen in the church have been, to revisit that. Because when we think about the Black Church, lots of people obviously think about gospel, and that's important as well. But there are all of these other genres of religious music that are present in Black churches as well. Anthems, hymns, spirituals as well, shifts in styles of gospelized hymns, right? All of these different moments. And so it gave me a chance to think back through those musical changes and what they meant to the people at the time as they were living them. And so I was really grateful to have an opportunity to have some input on that and to appear on that. And that project meant a lot to me too, because it was something that I do. Everybody can't take our classes at Juilliard, but that was on PBS. And so it's important to me to do things in places where the community to which I feel allegiance, the people who give me my knowledge, right? African Americans, musicians, and communities, that they can respond to the work that I'm doing as well. So I was grateful for that opportunity.
Well, maybe that is a perfect place to end, and we've just hit exactly 6 p.m. as well. So just issue you such a thank you for sharing your work, your approaches, your work on Graham Du Bois in particular, which is fascinating. And you'll have to keep us up to date on the progress of TomTom, and I will share it with our community. And meanwhile, we're so happy to hear from you. And Yeah, stay on the call, Fredara, after we turn off, and we'll say goodbye there. But thank you so much to everybody for listening, and I will circle back to everybody about our next guest, Joe Gashko, who is professor of harpsichord at the University of Michigan and curator of the instrument collection there. We'll hear from him in early April. So Fredara, thank you so much.
Thank you.